Hey, sports fans! Coach Nick here, and welcome to the B-Ball Breakdown live show. And in the very exciting new segment we're going to do every Monday to focus on the new HBO show. It's called Winning Time, that focuses on the Lakers and the Showtime era. And I'm pleased to bring on, as a co-host for this show, Roland Lazenby, who is a best-selling author, written the book on Michael Jordan called The Life, another book on Jerry West, The Life and Legend of a Basketball Icon. And even more importantly for this show, he has spent the last 4 years on a biography of Magic Johnson, which includes everything that we're watching on this HBO show. So, Roland, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate seeing you.
Thank you. How you doing, Nick?
I'm good. I'm hiding from COVID, and I've been successful so far. I hope that you have been too.
I caught it in January after hiding successfully for so long. Fortunately, I was fully vaccinated and boosted, so relatively mild.
Good. Well, glad that you're here with us now, and that hopefully everything is clear in your brain, so we can break some of this stuff down post COVID.
Well, I played rugby, so as they said of Gerald Ford, I probably played too much football without a helmet. But I think actually I played a year of college football, and I probably did more damage then. But no, I'm in command of my faculties.
Terrific. Well, there isn't a better person to bring in because I grew up in the era. I was the biggest Magic Johnson fan there was. I absorbed anything I could because, we might have to paint a picture of what it was like back in 1980, 81, or even into the mid 80s, where there wasn't much to consume other than what you'd read in like the local newspaper, right? Maybe, ESPN didn't exist in my life until the late 80s in Chicago. They didn't even have the cable there. So, the landscape of what you'd get back then was very limited, it seemed like, and probably like tightly controlled by the teams themselves.
Yes, Magic Johnson began as a rumor. And this is interesting, but the broadcast crew with Billy Packer and Al McGuire, when Magic Johnson was a freshman at Michigan State, they went to the regional final against Kentucky, the eventual champion, and they had not seen Magic play. Could you imagine today such a thing? Of course, basketball is everywhere. We do inhabit this wonderful age, but that's not what Magic Johnson came out of.
It's fascinating. Again, all these myths, and so I went back and started watching a couple of clips of games that they have on YouTube from that era. Because even growing up back then, you would hear about Magic Johnson, and you would hear about these even players from the Bulls that were growing up in Chicago, like in the 70s, but like you'd never see any footage. You have no idea what it really looked like. You had to rely solely on, the ability for someone to write it down and describe it properly. It's really exciting that we can go through this. In fact, I was able to do that this morning and find, I found one from his rookie year, but a couple from 82 and 83, which are appropriate because a big part of the first episode is this interesting dynamic between Norm Nixon and Magic Johnson, which ultimately is going to, I imagine, going to play out. We know, you and I know what's going to happen in this a couple of years down the line, and from the show where we are now. But what are your thoughts and impressions from the actual playing style back then, and what it was like, and how different it was, and why Magic was such a revelation?
Well, first of all, nearly everybody at one time or another admitted to me in interviews, all the top minds from Jerry West to Dr. Jack Ramsey, the coach of the Portland Trail Blazers, who just won an NBA title. None of them, and including the broadcast crew for the Final Four of Al McGuire, the championship coach, and Billy Packer, who a longtime basketball broadcaster, former all ACC player. None of these people had any belief, and this was along varying degrees, but none of them had any belief that Magic Johnson was going to be a factor in the NBA.
Interesting.
And they were all the best basketball minds. But, Magic had that very high dribble. He really didn't he had that sort of one-handed push set shot, which could be off or on any given night. Yes, he had the smile and all the full court brilliance, but there weren't a lot of people projecting him to be the top guy. Now, there were others. The Kansas City Kings wanted to draft him right after his freshman year, and they engaged in negotiations that ultimately fell apart. But it was far from a given that Magic Johnson, at almost 6'9", could go into the NBA and play point guard. And as Paul Westhead, his rookie coach, during that fabulous season of 1980, when as a rookie he led the Lakers to a title, even his coach said, we didn't play him all that much at point guard. That wasn't the deal. Um, it
Oh,
was not going to happen. He shared the ball, but more and more down the stretch, Norm Nixon and Michael Cooper were at the guards, and Magic Johnson played forward. And he sort of did that out of goodwill. Magic Johnson did. He knew that as a rookie, he could contribute immediately as a rebounding forward, a defender, with this tremendous energy. He still got into the open court and did his thing, of course, but he and Norm Nixon would sort of trade off the point guard duties.
yeah, and you definitely see that in the footage. The one thing you see in the show, and we'll get to the actual the making, the filmmaking in a minute, because I definitely want to talk about that and the fact that it's got a lot of the Big Short editing style, which one of my favorite movies. So it's great to be. But when they show Jerry West and they talk about the dribble and the high dribble. And, part of what I do on B-Ball Breakdown is trying to dispel a lot of the myths of what we used to teach all these years. And we're getting a nice insight into that, because when you study the good dribblers, even back then, they all dribbled about waist height. And yet when you'd hear these coaches, they would think that you need to dribble the ball like no higher than your knee. And when you think about a 6'9" player dribbling the ball, even at his knee or like his thigh high, like to them, that was just too high. It was going to get stolen. And I just find it so amazing to think about that now. And if you watch all those guys, then they didn't lose the ball. It wasn't stolen that much more easily because of that. And it just kind of just rings. That you keep seeing these different examples. In fact, I don't know if you saw King Richard, which was a tennis documentary or a tennis movie about the Williams sisters, but they had the father there doing the same thing, discussing these like ridiculous fundamentals of tennis that everyone seemed to think that were real, but when it turns out he was the guy who was right. So I love seeing those kind of things. It's really fascinating.
Well, that was Magic Johnson. And what I've done, as I did with my Kobe Bryant book, Showboat, not with Michael Jordan, The Life, I wanted to go back to the organic player. And I wanted, because Magic Johnson was the revolution. And he was not the revolution at 19 and 20. He was the revolution at 12 and 13 and 14 and 15. And he blew through every fundamental. And he was fortunate to have coaches in high school. There were some conflicts there, but wow. They just turned him loose. They didn't run set plays because Magic was obviously a rebounding machine in the open court. And I went into his pickup life there in Lansing with everybody from his teammates to, his high school coach's son. I went into this whole story because people have this view of Magic Johnson, and I'm a little disappointed in the film because it's sort of a cartoonish version of Irvin Johnson. It reminds me of the old Fat Albert kind of cartoons. Irvin Johnson, yes, he had the smile, and he wasn't. Today he's tremendously articulate and an on-point businessman, but back then he was a kid. Yet he drove the agenda everywhere he went, and when he got to Michigan State, he had a battle royal with Judd Heathcote, which I get into in the book. Judd Heathcote did not want him passing off the dribble. Think about that. And it was a battle.
Wow.
There are all kinds of things people don't know about that battle. But what I want to explain is that his genius, when you look at the crux of it, was this unbelievable, unmatched ability to pass off the dribble, to run a fast break like no one ever had. Red Auerbach, the great Celtics guy, said Magic Johnson was the only guy better than Cousy at that. And Cousy was the early pioneer of it. And Cousy got cut three times from his high school team.
Mm-hmm.
By a dean of coaches. And so, yes, there is the long story in basketball of the rise of the player who is able to force the agenda, his only power being the sheer way that he played. And that bird is Magic Johnson.
Wow. Interesting choice of phrase there, using the word bird, which they have not brought into yet, but we will get there, I'm sure, by soon. But here's what's interesting. A couple things for context we should probably understand in that landscape was, even in the college, freshmen weren't allowed to play varsity basketball in college up until right when Magic started, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was right in the mid 70s, and they allowed this to happen. Do you remember what year that was?
I remember it well because I played a year of Division I college football in 1970. We played a freshman schedule. None of the freshmen were eligible for the varsity, but every day we went against the varsity in practice in these wars. And, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar at UCLA was not eligible until he was a sophomore. Now, that did begin to change in the mid-70s. It actually changed, I believe, somewhere around 72, 73.
Right after. Well, by the way, Kareem's freshman team beat the varsity that year.
Right. You had cases of that. There were days when, and I was just at Virginia Military Institute, which was Division I back then, but there were days where, and I was 159-pound nose guard and linebacker, to sort of give you the idea. I was destined to be nothing but a practice player. But there were days we gave the varsity absolute fits because they were taking a terrible beating. And that's just the way sports went. The freshman teams were sort of loaded for bear each week. And so I don't care the sport, football, basketball, whatever, that set up this war within the programs.
Yeah. Well, so the other interesting thing about that is, so freshmen had just started being allowed to play. So you can imagine Judd Heathcote, who had been there for a while, doesn't even want to, the freshman, he's playing. Why would he even, how dare he want to bring the ball up at that size too? But the other interesting thing was, if you study the way the game was played up until around that point, it was a lot of two-guard front playing. So you'd had two guards even with each other bringing the ball up. And
even though it wasn't the triangle, the two-guard front was fashionable. The triangle, of course, kept the two-guard front for a long time.
Yeah, and you can see that even into, in the NBA at that time, Jerry West, when he played on those teams, and they actually had Bill Sharman, the coach, who was a triangle guy. So all of a sudden you want to have like one guy out front bringing the ball up into the teeth of the defense. That to a coach, a traditionalist coach from back then, would have been heresy. So, and by the way, so we not only have—
It's called a lead guard, not a point guard.
Lead guard. Okay.
And Jerry West, that 71-72 season was the first time in his career. I believe he was 30. I think he was 33 then, I'm pretty sure. And he became the lead guard for the first time in his career because they wanted to play Gail Goodrich off the ball. So basketball was evolving dramatically in that era.
For sure. And so we can thank Magic for the passing off the dribble, and it's disco, right? The disco movement is in full swing. And I just see a lot of connections between what Magic's doing on the court and what we saw, on Soul Train. There are a lot of just, it was dancing and it was loose and it was rhythmic. All those things that really, and creative, that exploded around that time, right? Coaches started to have a little bit less control over how the game was being played.
Oh, there were plenty of coaches with plenty of control. Magic loved the fans having fun, but everything he did was really sort of on the pickup laboratories of Lansing on the court, and he knew how to keep winning. And fun was his second priority. His first priority was always winning. And he really had that. His narrative, like all narratives of all great players, it has been manipulated a lot into the public thinking he was this overwhelming winner. And he won a lot of games in high school basketball, but he screwed up a lot too. And he screwed up in key championship moments, like he did in the '84 finals.
Yep.
And so the narrative wasn't perfect, but what was clear is that the coaches who read him accurately and looked at what he was doing on the floor gave him the ball. Now, he still wasn't the point guard and didn't think of himself as a point guard. He really was a unique player beyond position. His best friend on the team his first 2 years in Lansing was the point guard, but it was Irvin controlling the ball. And that was that way in pickup games.
Absolutely. And the pickup games, I think, again, became more of a thing. My mentor, who grew up in the late 60s, would talk about pickup going to the gym on the weekends, and they'd play 3-on-3. There were so many people in the gym that they would just play, so you can get or 4-on-4 on half court, so you get 16 people playing at the same time. And I have to imagine at some point out of that, they stopped doing that and made it more full court, and that opened things up too into the 70s.
Well, yes, Irvin played lots of one-on-one full court as a child at Main Street School. He played with himself. He went against his brother. It was all these different things that brought his evolution. The other big thing to understand is, as all of his teammates have explained, you may have had a way you played basketball, but you could no longer play the way you played. You were required to play the game that Irvin Johnson played. He was a force that not only changed the coaches, he changed the teammates, he changed everything in the basketball environment as he moved along.
Well, let's talk about the show itself a little bit, because there's some controversy and people are upset about certain things. First of all, as the Big Short editing style, I suppose we'll call it, when you talk, breaking the fourth wall, talking to the camera, lots of sort of quick cutting and referencing of other shots of things that are almost like non sequiturs to make a point. I love that, and I love that movie. So it was really fun to kind of be in that, because it does lend itself a little bit to 70s style filmmaking. They're doing a lot of picture-in-picture and overlaying of frames, which is right out of the 70s, which is, and they're actually color correcting and making this footage grainy at times, more than others. So it doesn't look slick and clean. It looks like a 70s gritty, film. So kudos to that. But I mean, the thing on top of my head, I would imagine that we would all push back on, which doesn't seem to be true, is this notion that Norm Nixon right off the bat was so hostile to Magic that he has a one-on-one game at Donald Sterling's house of all places, in their dress shoes, and somehow Magic gets completely embarrassed. I feel like this is one of those things where I was just scratching my head thinking the writers just wanted to have some conflict, and they came up with something that doesn't match anything in reality.
Yeah, they can be as cute as they want in the editing. I enjoy all kinds of film work. And, Adam McKay has done Succession, which supposedly is really about the Trump family, but he didn't call it the Trump family.
Right.
He has gone in and, I've paid a heavy price to write about the Lakers. Jerry West is a god there, an icon, and they protected him. I reported a scene with Jerry West telling me, F Phil Jackson. And I go, no, Jerry, you must have misunderstood me. Oh, no, F Phil Jackson. I broke the story in the Chicago Sun-Times about Phil Jackson kicking Jerry West out of the locker room during the Portland series in the 2000 run to the championship, saying, Jerry, this is a team-only meeting. Mm-hmm. And in classic Phil style of, just playing the and sometimes the most brutal mind games possible. And, the Lakers pulled my press credential. They have the PR staff led by John Black just slaughtered me for years. And they in some ways continue to do it. I know this for a fact because Tex Winter told me so. Tex was working there. He said, "You do not understand." And I had been warned that they could do that. And they rightfully protected their icon. To think that what I went through just to report key facts. I was told that I was destroying the Laker franchise, and they went on, of course, to win those 5 titles. All I was doing was showing things that were verboten.
Mm-hmm.
And now for them to take these licenses and to engage in some ways, character assassination. Not that there's not elements of truth in it about Jerry West, but the character of Bill Sharman is nothing like Bill Sharman. And he had an important, critical, huge role in Lakers history. But for them to take these facts and to give them to millions of people as if this is, and I know they put those little sentences at the beginning and the end. That doesn't stop bullshit from stinking very much like bullshit. And they didn't have to do this. We're struggling in an age of propaganda where everything has been distorted and used for whatever purpose. And I just question, because we have a lot of serious issues with the Lakers and what happened in that era. And the whole tone of the thing, and I'm not a guy who was ever in line to let me be clear. Jeff Pearlman is a fabulous writer. The works he creates are based on incredible research.
Mm-hmm.
I am in awe of the things he has accomplished in the book industry. For them to distort this with, and I talked to Lon Rosen this morning. Now, Lon, first a longtime Lakers employee, and then Magic Johnson's agent, and sort of a big figure in LA today with the Dodgers and all those things. Lon said this. I'll just tell you this morning. About the kinds of things you're talking about, the one-on-one, all this stuff with Jerry Buss having this big deal with Red Auerbach. That's all made up stuff, all made up. This is not based on fact. And so I'm particularly irritated because I've worked on this biography. When you write a biography, and I end up writing 600-700 pages just to get all the context in, if you get a T that's not crossed or an I, you get eviscerated.
Mm-hmm.
And you're dealing, my Michael Jordan book, the BBC estimated it sold about 700,000 copies. It's in 20 languages worldwide. Now, the piracy on it is maybe another 1 million readers. I don't know. But HBO is going to reshape the history of the Lakers for millions of viewers. And I just don't agree. I do not agree with this approach. I find it reprehensible. Having said all that, there are parts of it I think are just stupid, but it is fun as fiction with elements of truth laced in. And I understand that we got 6 more seasons of this coming.
Wow. Well, that's why we're here. We got to make sure that people can get the right truth. Because again, anybody who's younger than 30 could very well take this as the truth because they don't.
They will. It's just different generations receive their information primarily one way. These internet arguments are going to be insane because, as much as people loved The Last Dance, and some did not, but it generated a lot of debate and interest based on the facts.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like the facts of the Lakers weren't enough for these guys. They've got people out of place, events out of place. They've basically put the story of the Lakers, mixed in a lot of hokum, and put it all in a blender and punched the button.
Yeah. And the Jerry West stuff let's get into a little bit is interesting because, you know, I spent time around the guy. And, you know, certainly he doesn't, and it's already been sort of verified across the board. Like, this is not the kind of guy. He's not a guy who's throwing stuff through windows and having connections. He's chewing the scenery. And the thing is, the actor is playing him is a really good actor. And I'm not exactly sure why they decided to let him do like so overact that it's like a comedy almost. It's ridiculous. And we know that that's not what Jerry West was like. And I get that they want to do conflict and they want to, you know, create interesting scenes, but it just seemed like there must be something else to why they targeted him of all people to end up having such a departure from what the reality was.
Well, you start with the great Bill Sharman. He had no voice. I've got hours of interviews with him where he could very hardly speak. It's hard to listen to him. And if they wanted to tell the truth of the Lakers, he destroyed his voice in the 72 championship series. And they've got him looking like some guy who did about 5 years in the Marine Corps and, you know, is just dealing with Jerry West. Jerry West started running the Lakers for all intents and purposes. It was a while before he was named the GM. But he started running the Lakers in 1981. Now think about it. The figure you see on TV, and Jerry has his shortcomings, and he can have a quick fuse sometimes. But Jerry can also be tremendously diplomatic. He is a very complex figure. And the guy you see on that TV screen, there's no way in hell that he's going to end up being GM of the Lakers. That you would have to be, and conversely, they're portraying. I know Jeannie Buss loves her father dearly, but Jerry Buss was no basketball visionary or icon. He had even the Showtime girls are in debate as to the genesis of that. And I've done the interviews, and I would just say Jerry Buss was never in practice. Now he, as that season went on, he had a situation where he had Paul Westhead, this backup assistant coach he didn't know anything about. But you know, Jerry Buss was not in favor of Magic jumping center in Game 6 of the 1980 Finals that led to the real core of Irvin Johnson's legacy. And he told Paul Westhead that if he was going to start Magic at center, it was a huge gamble and he was going to pay the consequences if that gamble didn't work. And so Jeannie was away. She was there. Jeannie had done her bit with the LA Strings, the tennis team Jerry Buss owned, and she was a promising young teenager. But I did multiple interviews with her, and she really had no memory of the events on the courts or any of that stuff. And she was very honest about that. She was a student at USC. She had a serious boyfriend. She later married a volleyball player and lived in Europe. So she was gone for a huge portion of this. The woman they've set up as Jack Kent Cook's assistant had nowhere near the power she is shown as having and being this figure. And so this is not the story of the Lakers in Showtime.
And I mean, well, I'll say, I get it why they wanted to tie some loose ends in together and maybe get Jeannie in there earlier and have her have a different role so that she could be part of this later. Like, that kind of makes sense. I'm not so sure why they wanted to have her be kind of like, you know, unattractive. Jeannie Buss is glamorous, right? She's especially back then, she was very glamorous. And the whole character right now is sort of this non-glamorous, you know, young woman. And again, I what they decided was we need maybe she'll become this glamorous person, right? And that's an interesting character arc that makes it, you know, a better storytelling, I suppose.
Well, the characters, Jerry Buss is almost a threatening guy sometimes. And I love these actors individually, but Jerry Buss almost comes across as something of a buffoon. Um, this is a complex story, and they've made an outrageous cartoon of it. What they've done to Jerry West really smacks of score settling. We know that Jeannie Buss has withdrawn Jerry's tickets that he has been promised for all of his years of insanity and service and trying to make the Lakers great. Norm Nixon and Jerry, that's and of course, Norm Nixon has an influence on this. I don't know where all this comes from, but it's not. This is not. I don't know how Jeff Pearlman feels about it. He had me on his blog, about a month ago. He's a great guy. He's a great journalist. I assume Hollywood is a force unto itself. I'm probably naive about all of this, but I guess in the context of our times, I find this really unsettling.
Huh.
But
Okay.
that's.
It's interesting because I don't know if I feel unsettled by it. But I just kind of it gets confusing. I just kind of scratch my head thinking that's just not right. That's not how it matters. But again, this is Hollywood, and they that disclaimer or not, I guess you're allowed to do that, and they've done this countless times in all sorts of biographies based on true stories.
Right. Patch Adams. I happened to have been living in Richmond at that time. I had a dear friend who was in med school with him, and he was a legendary figure. But the license taken with the Patch Adams story is probably similar to some of this. It's just that, as The Ringer said, this is like The Crown. The Crown is the story that ran for seasons. It still has one more season of the British royalty. And it's a very slow telling in great detail. And this is going to go on for 6 seasons. We're only going to finish the 1980 season at the end of this first season.
Wow. Well, and there's plenty to go through. I mean, what we can look forward to, and obviously Norm Nixon probably doesn't like Jerry West because Jerry West traded him from a team that was a perennial championship contender every year to the Clippers in basketball purgatory, especially back then. So I get that as well.
There's nobody ever who loved great guards more than Jerry West. Mm-hmm. And he had an incredibly good guard tandem in Norm Nixon with Magic Johnson. And you throw in Michael Cooper and how they could move things, just tremendous flexibility on that roster. But I've got interviews with Jerry. He's haunted by that trade to this day. He did what was best. And it was clearly what was best for Magic Johnson and the Lakers. And, from this, you think Magic and Jerry are going to have this horrible relationship, but that's so overdone. It doesn't make sense. The amazing relationship they had going forward. And Norm Nixon was a really fine player. He was a tremendous aid to Magic Johnson as he adjusted to trying to play pro point guard. They had 2 guards. The tandem, it wasn't always a 2-guard front because if Magic got the ball, he was off and blazing. And Norm Nixon could do the same. He just didn't have the size to get to the basket the way Magic did.
Right. Now I guess we can foreshadow a little bit, because, well, I'm sure that, by the 82-83 season, they're going to have a whole, 6-episode arc devoted to this. But, we have to remember the reason why, well, first of all, the reason why we haven't even gotten to Paul Westhead yet, which is, I'm curious to see how they're going to deal with this as far as Jack McKinney in that year getting hurt, and then Paul Westhead taking over, who you mentioned.
Well, the murder of Vic Weiss and the loss of Jerry Tarkanian as a coach, that whole year, it's a big part of my forthcoming Magic book. And I part of my difficulty is I've worked so hard to tell this story, and I'm having to give parts of it up just to try to correct what I'm seeing.
Okay, well, you don't have to give it all up, but it's a nice little, you can give us a little taste that we're going to want to read more for sure. But the point being, what Magic was the guy that instigated the whole thing, right? He basically demanded the trade because, and you can see this on the court by 82-83. He's not getting the ball as much as we are used to seeing, like in 80 after that, 84, 85, 86, when he's leading those titles. Norm Nixon's the guy bringing the ball up. It's a little bit slower when he does it. And Magic is just, he's like, get me the ball. I want to run. We got to go. And it wasn't happening. I think ultimately he ends up demanding a trade, right? Or he says, or the coach, one of us has to go. And it seemed like obviously Jerry West's solution was get rid of the coach, and that's how Pat Riley becomes the coach. And then B, they trade Norm Nixon not that much longer after that, and that's that. It sort of seems to be all spurred from Magic's demands.
Well, Magic, he had this relationship with Jerry Buss. Jerry West and Bill Sharman, none of those guys, even Pat Riley, did not want to get rid of Paul Westhead. That was absurd. And Paul Westhead was one of the great running coaches of all time. He was the mad scientist of running. So this is a narrative that's concocted that Magic could, and all the credit I give Magic as the organic Magic, he had these various times in his career when he would rebel against the coaching. And he did it in Lansing several times. And he had the people around him then that could rein it in. But when he had this rebellion, and there was impatience. I've gone on in extended interviews with Paul Westhead about what happened. And Magic's own documentary is coming out soon on the heels of this first year. And so we're going to see probably a much more truthful approach to all of this. But the Lakers were a very unusual team. They had all of this running ability suddenly with Magic, but they had the greatest half-court weapon in basketball history. And there's no coach in America. And when they struggled in the playoffs, they struggled because there were times they couldn't execute well in the half court. And we all know that you can do a lot of running in the playoffs. The Celtics of Bill Russell proved a lot of that. But I don't care what you got as a running team. You got to play a lot of half-court basketball in the playoffs. And Paul Westhead was simply saying, guys, and there are all these things going on in the roster, a lot of immature behavior. Kareem was not very easy to get along with in some ways, and a gentleman in others. Very complex stuff, of which I get into in great detail in my book. But the point is, all Paul Westhead was doing is saying, look, we got to be able to do this and that. And, Magic was so empowered. No one had the power of Magic Johnson. Magic Johnson presaged, as I explain in my book, the great age of player power today, which, it's not terrible. The players don't make any bigger messes than the owners did back in the day. I'm not upset over whoever's got the power. They just have to have the logic. But anyway, there's a lot of context needed for what Magic did, and it was he basically fired his own coach.
Yeah. Yeah, and I could see. I mean, you can't argue with the results. He was right in some respects that it wasn't working as well, even though they'd already won a title. I mean, there's some like interesting
He
parallels.
was coming off a tremendous injury,
Right.
and he was not ready. He was insecure because of that injury. You can't think of Magic Johnson ever as being insecure, but he was also very impatient to try to get back. And, he really was trying to get to be the guy he was. But they were, and a big part of this comes down to Paul Westhead's experience in basketball. He wasn't trying to be buddy buddy. He was, Paul Westhead coached Joe Jelly Bean Bryant to the NCAA tournament, and Jelly Bean was the first joke of a big man who could do incredible things with the basketball, and was part of the bomb squad in Philadelphia. So Paul Westhead he was perfectly willing to let Jelly Bean take that great LaSalle team in '75 to the NCAA tournament, which was a big deal back then. Paul Westhead was not some martinet. They were all out of that Jack Ramsey school. You weren't buddy buddy. You had things to do. You coached, the players played. It was not a lot of coddling. And but it wasn't a lot of rudeness either. I mean, it was. I just think the whole thing was an overreaction by Magic Johnson.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and we've seen this before. I mean, LeBron James, we've seen this happen as well, where he tries to sort of control the rosters and take control of the whole franchise in a way, and deservedly so when you have that much ability on the court. And I totally sense that we're going to probably see a little bit of that manipulation as we go forward with what Magic did. I have a quick question for you, though.
I just want to add one thing. It was a happy accident. Pat Riley had all of this ability. He was a lowly worm around the Lakers at the time, and suddenly, boom, because of a series of events, he was on the bench suddenly. And Pat Riley rose to the occasion. But the other thing is that Magic Johnson had done this great thing. He was booed everywhere, and it went on for a long time. This was a violation of what the value system of American sports fans. And Magic rose up with his level of play, but Riley knew what needed to be done. He was better at selling it. But those Lakers became a team that could play half court, could run like the Dickens. All of those things that Westhead was trying to do came to pass.
One thing I'm wondering if it's going to come up is that, Magic Johnson was not called Magic to his teammates. He had a different nickname, and they called him Buck. And as I understand it, it was because he was so tough and he would run so hard and relentlessly like a buck,
He was a young buck in training camp, but he had been called Buck earlier in his life.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And he had a variety of nicknames. Irv. People will say, "Oh, I didn't ever call him Magic." BS. They called him Magic. They called him Irv. They called him Buck. They call him EJ. They called him E. When you're on a sports team, as we both know, there are any number of terms of endearment. And I don't know how this became selective. I had people telling me, "Oh, we never called him Magic." And during the interview, they were calling him Magic constantly. And so this is complex stuff. It requires a fair amount of context. I understand the assumptions for television have to be easy. I guess the viewers can't take it. They don't have the intelligence to absorb complexity. It is a much bigger task for the writers to convey it and to convey some humanity. But I so far, I just see cartoonish figures.
Right. But I wouldn't put it on the viewers. I definitely would put it on Anna McKay and their decisions that way to not trust that the audience could handle this. Here's what's interesting. They're kind of trying, because the way they're portraying Jerry West, aside from the chewing the scenery stuff, which I think is just ridiculous, whether or not you want to comment on this or not, clearly what they're implying is that he has a mental disorder. He's either, manic depressive or bipolar. When he's sitting in a room for 3 straight days, won't come out on the ground. Like, first the shot is interesting. We saw last night. It appears like he's like on the couch or he's on the bed or something. When they finally pull out, he's on the floor, curled up and, in his underwear, and then gets manic. And then all of a sudden starts, getting all excited about stuff. That is some complex stuff that they could be dealing with in a different way. And it's a very interesting dichotomy. I can't quite figure out what the tone is for this whole show.
Whether it's factual or not, it's used to assassinate or question his character. And it smacks of score settling, because and I understand they want to be irreverent, but they're not irreverent with everyone. It's not and in some way cartoonish in this. I don't know. I have to see. There are other parts of it they do a very good job with. His father, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll just have to continue to see. Maybe you tear these people down. I guess that's a standard in series today. It's a formula approach. You tear them down, you make them bad guys or unlikable people. And out of that, they change over time. And that's a dramatic device.
It's interesting.
I prefer reality. I guess I'm just a journalist and a biographer. I just
Sure. I mean, listen, I have a little experience in it. I remember writing a screenplay about the CCNY basketball team from 1950, and doing a lot of research, trying to get everything done right, but then realizing, we're going to have to do some things here to make this work better and make it more compelling. But
Sure.
But what's compelling, the reality is compelling with the Lakers. Like, that's the interesting thing, is they didn't need to do too much because there was already so much insanity going on. So here's what's interesting. Here's a theme that keeps coming up to me is childhood, sort of traumatic childhood. We talk, you keep hearing Jerry Buss talking about how he grew up poor. Jack Hancock grew up poor. Magic Johnson clearly has a mother who didn't love him. You have
that's the other thing. I was calling. I made calls this morning because I have spent hours rebuilding. It's an architectural project, rebuilding the whole story of Magic's rise through all this coaching. There was no one who ever, now it may be some internal thing. And Magic was very protective over the years. I know in my dealings with him, of his relationship with his mother. And he obviously had great love for her, tremendous respect for his father. I just don't think anyone, maybe the mother had this deep sense of this adolescent out of control, running around, but no, that's not the world I found. And I mean, the the teammates and stuff who Magic was, I was a varsity head coach at 24 years old in that era, right in the heart of that. Before that, I had been an assistant football coach at Petersburg Peabody Junior High, which was the old high school where Moses Malone went. I was in the heart of all the integration and all the societal issues. And so I was eager to resurrect that age in Lansing, Michigan. It was an amazing thing. And I've dealt with a lot of 15-year-old kids. Magic Johnson, Irvin Johnson Jr. was as impressive a 15-year-old kid as I've ever encountered.
Huh. Well, and by the way, you can see that like when you find in his first game against the Clippers in 1979, Brett Musburger interviews him before the game, and he comes off as impressive, just like he did at age 30. And then he was 19, whatever he was. It really was impressive that way, how prepared he was for that stage. Here's interesting. Let's do a couple details here from the show. I'm going to share the screen real quick. Let me see how this works. Add to stream. So I don't know if you caught this, but I took a quick screenshot of this. When they had the NBA owners meeting last night, they completely misspell welcome. And I just kind of wonder, like, these are the little details that they throw in here all the time. And it's kind of fun in that what Moneyball way. Remember in Moneyball where they would show just all sorts of ridiculous methods that they used to do in the sporting world back then. What do you make of that, of misspelling the word welcome?
I have no trouble at all with that. The NBA of 1979, that's sort of in some ways emblematic of the story of American professional basketball. It really didn't have a very large audience. It was in trouble. And so you've got to do that in all sorts of ways. It certainly didn't have the staffing to, on one hand, they'll go to great lengths to create a detail like that. And this is what's mystifying about it, because it's almost like they're trying to put a veneer of supposed reality of that era on this with all their stylistic things. And then they'll go out and just slaughter the truth and slaughter the facts purposefully. And I mean, just take huge license with everything, but in the process also slaughter character and the perception of a person. And I'm not going to get into a whole lot about Jerry West. Already have gotten into too much, but they're just playing fast and loose with real people, and I find that deeply offensive.
Okay. Well, they're also spending a lot of time with Magic and Cookie, who becomes his wife later on. And
yeah, that whole scene, like I said, happened years later.
The whole scene with him confronting her and telling her how he feels.
Oh no, they did plenty of that with that boyfriend. And it came about only after a series of very low things, many low things that Magic did to the amazing and unbelievable Cookie Kelly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
it happened, and this was one of his friends. This was not some guy in a shoe store. This was not some guy. This was a hellacious player, one who almost took the championship away from Magic as a senior. And this is sort of addressed. This is from Cookie's own book. And I assume they paid her to be able to manipulate those facts. I don't know. I'm not a Hollywood insider. I'm some old bird, but there's that word again. But it certainly didn't happen there, and didn't happen in that context of that situation. It actually happened in the gym in Lansing after when he was home, and he just had a chance encounter with them while he was cruising around one day.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so stealing her from his friend is one thing. What I don't seem to get so far is why she liked him in the first place. He doesn't seemed to be coming off as a very charming person, and that was what was weird to me. Again, if I'm a writer and I have this weird mantra of like the secret to writing good, TV is conflict, then let's create as much as we can, and we'll keep creating more and more. But like, to me, it just felt strange why Cookie would even look at him in any kind of favorable light, how he was behaving.
The real story is too complex for these TV writers to handle in the cartoon they've created.
Okay.
And as one of Irvin's closest associates explained to me, well, I don't really want to end up laying my whole book on the line here because it doesn't come out till fall of 2023.
Oh, wow.
But I'll just say it's a complex thing. And their relationship began innocently in college.
Okay.
And Irvin's life very quickly, dating back to high school, began getting out of control. And it really is a serious issue because he was quite a hero. He was widely admired, and he destroyed all that. And he had the character enough to begin to deal with it, and dealt with it, I think, in amazing ways. He also still carried forward a lot of his human failings. But it's the story of an amazing guy, and he came along right in the age of great promiscuity, and he was faced with a promiscuity that Hugh Hefner never had, and he spent a fortune for promiscuity.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I have this long explanation for everything about the organic magic, or the organic Irvin, and I've just maybe I'm a bit overloaded trying to figure out how you can take the facts and do this to them. But it's fun. It's a cartoon, and the Lakers will be a cartoon in a lot of ways. A lot of people think they had to hype things.
Mm-hmm.
They had to hype this thing with Auerbach and Jerry Buss. There's so much hype in this story. You don't have to do all that. I'm wrong, though. I'm sure I'm wrong, and I'll get upbraided for it. But I'm going to say what my impression is. I've put in the time on this story.
Mm-hmm.
I've taken this back to Irvin Johnson's fourth great grandmother and the story of his people. But I've also put in incredible hours. And so I'm just, I guess I'm a little crotchety about it.
Less
too philosophical.
That's all right. That's all right, Boomer. We'll call you a boomer, and then we'll laugh about it. We have some questions though from the audience. So let's bring on somebody in and let's see what we have to say. So let's bring Aaron in. He wants to ask a question. Aaron, are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you great.
Well, to be honest, Coach Nick, thank you for this opportunity, but I don't have a question related to directly what you guys are talking about, and I don't want to interrupt that. So maybe at another time when it's an open-ended discussion question. It's basketball related, but not.
We need a break. We need a break.
Yeah, throw it out there. We'll see. We'll decide after you ask.
Okay. Well, Coach Nick, I really admire how you approach the game and you see the game in its art form, and I wanted to see how excited you are for today, in which the trio's coming back in Draymond, Clay, and Steph Curry. Granted, it is their first game back, so there may be some rust, but what are you most excited about, especially heading into April, if they are your favorites?
Well, I think I'm Roland. You don't mind? We'll take a minute on this one.
I think that's great. I'm very excited by all of the things, particularly the return of a great warrior in Klay Thompson, and then now back Draymond. It's just a remarkable team and has been.
And he's much needed. Their defense has been really suboptimal for a long time since he's been gone. And the lineup I'm looking forward to most is Draymond, Looney, then Poole, Clay, and Steph. They haven't played that lineup at all this year because of all the injuries and Clay, and then then Draymond getting injured. So I think that might end up being their depth lineup that they end up using a lot. That would really change the game, which is ironic or crazy because now you're talking about not having like Wiggins out there who's having an all-star year. You're talking about not having gosh, I'm dropping anybody else.
Andre Iguodala.
Yeah, Iguodala, I think on the margin, he'll get a couple minutes here and there. I don't think they're going to rely on him. I think he's just past his prime. So, but that's
Iguodala's there for his mind and presence as much as anything right now.
Yeah,
and ability to just show up in moments.
Yeah. And so, I think Otto Porter might actually benefit from playing more against second teams. So if they start with that lineup, I think I would love to see that, and then let the other guys fall in. But again, the biggest issue Steve Kerr is going to have is managing this roster of 12 guys who are all viable players. And I don't know how he's going to do it. I suspect that some of the rookies are just simply not going to play, or they're going to get 5 minutes or something, and that's okay. And they'll develop a little bit, and then they'll be ready to go. When Clay and Steph are ready to retire, and they won't miss much of a beat with those younger guys getting that kind of experience.
Thank you, Coach.
You got it. Thanks, Aaron. All right, we have another one, Roland, and hopefully this will be about the show. Let's see. This will be here. Let's do
that.
This
was a refreshing break. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, listen, I had only said in all caps in the comments, only ask a question about this show. So we got the first one, but thank you, Aaron. That was great. John, let's bring John in and see what he wants to talk about. John, are you there?
Yes, sir. I think so, Coach Nick. Am I here?
Loud and clear. Sounds good.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Lazenby, for your time.
Thank you, John.
So I was watching this with my dad. We couldn't get through the first episode. Like, he had to cut it off. Like, my dad's a pretty old dude, and he told me, like, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. Nowadays, it's hard to distinguish, unfortunately, between artistic liberties and fiction and the narrative for, like, a story between the actual truth. My question for Mr. Lazenby is, how do you think they're going to tackle, and if you have any insight into this, I'd love to know the story of the Clippers from their move to San Diego to Los Angeles. From my understanding, Jerry Buss and Donald Sterling had like a business relationship even before Donald bought the team. And he's probably the worst owner of all time behind Ted Steichen when he was running the Cavs. Looking through that like Clippers team during the 80s, they had some solid players and pieces, but from my understanding, his cheapness just, like nothing could cohese. I think they had like Terry Cummings, like you said, Joe Bryant, Roby Free, old man Bill Walton, young Tom Chambers. Like, they had good players. So I like to know what you think is going to happen.
Well, as soon as Donald Sterling bought the Clippers, everything they were building fell apart. And he had the image of this guy with a lot of money, but he was the ultimate cheapskate. And he interfered as an owner. All the things that became obvious. I do think that he and Jerry Buss, at the heart of the thing, were real estate guys. And the big thing about Jerry Buss getting the Lakers, and I went to Virginia Military Institute with Ron Carter, who played for the Lakers and then worked for Jerry Buss for years. And Ron and I have talked many times about this over the years, but primarily the Lakers were a honeypot for Jerry Buss to sell his real estate deals to all the people attracted there. And of course, he was interested in building the attraction because of the honeypot. And Magic Johnson and Jerry Buss had this thing. Part of their friendship was based on their going after the female population of Hollywood. Wow. And in some ways, Magic was a honeypot for Jerry, because Jerry Buss, according to all the people who know him, had a street team to acquire. He liked 20-year-old women, and he basically had guys out acquiring these women for him. And he kept notebooks of them, of the women he dated. He'd usually date them once or twice. as one journalist said, who knew him well, Scott Osler, Scott also dated Jeannie Buss, but he told me in an interview once that, it was sort of revolting to see Jerry Buss get out his collection of photographs of all these young women that he'd acquired and dated. He would boast about them. He had all kinds of things he would boast about. But he said, Jerry Buss was basically a case of arrested development. So the other thing about the cartoon is that it really doesn't go to who these people are. And Jerry Buss was great, but he was a business guy with Donald Sterling. And the reason he was so welcome, there's a hint of that in this because they really do have to keep those buildings busy all the time. And Jerry was a pioneer in many things with the sports franchise. I don't want to discount that at all. I think he's fascinating for who he is. But if you think about it, they're building Staples Center and they need that partnership with the Clippers. Now, the Clippers were had come in earlier and were in the other arena, the old LA Sports Arena. But they ended up, being an important piece of being able to build Staples Center. And so this was all two real estate guys who didn't think exactly the same way. Jerry Buss was, by many accounts, amazingly refreshing in that era and his attitude toward race. He was genuine in that. And of course, we know Donald Sterling was not. And so while they shared business interests, and, if you're in an industry like real estate in LA and you are the kingpins of that industry in some regards, or at least prominent figures, you're going to have that kind of mutual relationship wherever you can be friends or work together. But they were very different men in their value system.
And I'll just jump in there. My first instinct would have been like, no, they're not going to deal with the Clippers at all, in this show. But then I thought, well, they're like addicted to conflicts, right? This show is all about like how much conflict, and they're like, so I can imagine, hey, a new team in town, they get the battle for business, and then plus you get to throw Donald Sterling in there more because they've already set him up a little bit with the White Party, which, by the way, like they might be mixing time frames. I know the Blake Griffin story with going to the all white party where you have to dress in all white, and they're making this into when Magic was there, which maybe he was doing it the whole time either way. But the bottom line is, I could see how easy it would be for these writers to be like, oh my God, let's get Donald Sterling in here, no problem. We can deal with all the race stuff, we can deal with all the cheap stuff, and we can deal with the competition between him and the Lakers. So it's probably going to happen.
There's not a more prominent Clippers fan than Jimmy Goldstein. And I've talked to Jimmy about this. Right as Jerry Buss was coming in and the Lakers were getting this magical upgrade, not just Magic Johnson, but they got Jim Jones, they got all kinds of people in the front court to finally give Kareem what he needed as far as a power forward beside him. But Donald Sterling was just downgrading the Clippers dramatically. Just as Jerry Buss was coming in with a different attitude. And the Clippers fans, the long-suffering Clippers fans, had to suffer through those humiliations. I spent a lot of time with Terry Cummings talking about all of this, and it was very tough on Clippers players. They would be so envious of being able to play with a guy like Magic and all that Showtime did. But yeah, there's Jimmy.
Yep.
And courtside, famous guy, knows LA basketball, knows basketball in general. But the Lakers sort of pissed all over the Clippers just in their success and the Clippers being a very frustrating, poorly run franchise. And suddenly, at least the Clippers could hide down in San Diego before, but once they came to LA, it was a juxtaposition. That's a 50-cent word I learned a while back. They were side by side and then eventually playing in the same building, and you could get a full look at the difference. Slowly, that has probably helped the Clippers some, but it's still sort of a team haunted by all of those years of abuse.
Mm-hmm. We have one more person because we're running long in the show, but maybe we'll grab one more person to see what they want to ask. And then, but just by the way, as we're moving along in the Clippers lore, like they're going to get their own stadium again, as Ballmer is going to build his known, $1 billion thing. So, and probably rightfully so. It's time to decouple those two teams and get them. Maybe the
just the humiliation of having to cover up the banners and these things are not. You can't just get out of an arena deal every day. And so this is like turning around the aircraft carrier, but I applaud the move for them to get their own arena, as long as, Ballmer's the kind of guy who's going to use his own money as opposed to an abundance of public funds to do it, I assume.
Yeah. Good. All right. Well, here we go. Let's bring something on the show. Are you there? Something.
I mean, I felt like the show was pretty decent despite its flaws, but I had like two questions. I suppose I could ask the first one, and the question is, I felt like the underdog. I felt like they were trying to drive home this idea that the Lakers were an underdog in this show, and I don't follow with it. I don't understand it because they've already won a championship now, and they have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar on their team. And on top of that, they're in LA, so I don't understand this underdog idea.
Well, the Celtics themselves were coming out of the worst record in the league. That's how Larry Bird ended up with Rookie of the Year, because they improved so dramatically from their miserable record. Things had been good for the Celtics somewhat, pretty much in the 70s with Dave Cowens, and at least as a follow-up to the great Bill Russell, it worked. They had an array of really good players, but it got bad in a hurry there at the end of the decade. So no, the Lakers were a better team at that time than the Celtics.
Yeah. And as a result, but the Lakers weren't elite, but they were still pretty good under Jerry West for those 3 years. They won, 50 games each of those years and were made the playoffs. But they do make it seem like they were right. There's a couple lines in there that make it feel like the Lakers were the last in the league or something really bad, and everyone had accepted not winning. Like the big speech that Jerry Buss gives on top of the desk, where he's like, "We're not going to be like we used to be," is a little bit weird, only because, yes, there was a standard there that seemed to already exist where they were winning anyway.
Yeah, and I will say Jerry West was tortured because the Lakers had an opportunity to get Julius Erving when the Nets were giving him up when the ABA closed down, and Jack Kent Cook refused to do it. To have Julius Erving and Kareem on the same roster, and Jerry told me this personally, this is not something that floats around as common knowledge, but it drove him insane to sit there on the bench with a mishmash roster around Kareem, and to think that we could have had Julius Erving. We'd probably think entirely different of Julius Erving too, because there are so many things that could have changed this to where Showtime never would have happened. The coin flip was Chicago. Imagine Magic going to Chicago, and he wanted to go there. It's a misnomer that he wanted to go to the Lakers. That was too far from home. There were things about the Lakers he loved, but anyway, it's that's complexity, and complexity doesn't work well in cartoons.
And really quickly, just make a couple connections. I did a video on this and how Magic got to the Lakers. It's fascinating. And you mentioned Dr. J, the tantalizing pairing perhaps between Kareem and Dr. J. Well, we also almost had that with Pete Maravich and Dr. J earlier in the 70s. And out of that, because Pete Maravich was playing in New Orleans at the time, and they had whatchamacallit, the Lakers had Gail Goodrich. New Orleans decided they wanted to pair Gail Goodrich and Pete Maravich together. So when they signed Gail Goodrich back in the day, the NBA got to determine what the compensation was going to be. And Bill Burtka, who becomes the coach, the longtime coach of the Lakers, assistant to Riley, was the executive in New Orleans at the time, was very happy with the package. Had it worked out, had Gail Goodrich not been injured so much and they would have played, I think it probably would have been one of the more exciting duos. But one of those picks that ended up having to get back to the Lakers was that first round pick in 79.
That's also the probably, you mentioned Bill Burtka, Bill Sharman. You had all these really decent people who were the heart and soul of the Lakers. This gives the impression that it's almost like the Lakers are running a cat house, or that, and that was, the Lakers did work very hard to obscure, as all of Hollywood has ever done with whatever star is doing whatever. But the Lakers had an ethos, a standing of all-time good people and great minds. And so this sort of trashes all that. You had a second question?
Yeah, something. You have another question?
I was wondering about how would you feel if it was, instead of the 80 Lakers, the 01 Lakers, or one of the 2000s versions of the Lakers?
Well, Jeff Pearlman has written a second book. I wrote a biography of Kobe Bryant called Showboat, and I started communicating with Jeff because he wanted to contact information for some of my sources. And he was Jeff is a great writer. I can't emphasize that enough. A great researcher and very generous in giving me credit for the whole story of Kobe's life. But Jeff has a second book called Three Ring Circus that has been successful. And it too is optioned by HBO. So not only probably do we face another 6 seasons of Winning Time, but we're going to do probably 6 seasons of Three Ring Circus. And I was there for so much of that because I was so close with the great Tex Winter, who really changed my life as he did many others.
Well, and by the way, full disclosure, Roland and I are connected through Tex Winter,
right?
Because Tex was also a mentor toward me, and when I was coaching the Triangle Offense, and so I'm throwing it out there. Whoever is going to do that show for Three Ring Circus, you better hire me to help do the basketball coordinating, is all I'm going to tell you, because there's no one who knows the triangle that much. I mean, there are a few, but not many left of us out there, right, Roland, who know the triangle that well.
Well, just to that point, you know, Tim Cohn, the great triangle coach from the Philippines, is a dear friend of mine. And, you know, the story of him climbing the tower to get the video so that he could learn the triangle, and he won 22 championships with it. But the terrible tragedy of the NBA today is that the suits have changed the rules and made it impossible to run the triangle. And even Phil Jackson didn't recognize it when it happened. And poor Derek Fisher took the fall for it. But changing the timeline and the reset on offensive rebounds, you cannot run much of a set offense in the NBA today, and certainly not the triangle. And Tim Cohn, who won 22 championships with it, had to give it up in the Philippines.
Yeah, I mean, listen, you give up the pure triangle, but I see the actions all out of the triangle all over the place too.
No question. The corner series, the Warriors came out blazing at doing all the spread the floor, the back cuts, all the little tricks of Tex in the playoffs. Obviously, Steve Kerr knew those.
All right. Well, you know what, Roland, we need to do that's a separate show we'll do. And
right,
we'll talk
I understand.
about the triangle too. But listen, I think we've got a great show here, and we're going to do this every week, everybody out there. So stay tuned every Monday. We're going to do a recap of the last show we just saw on the Sunday night from the HBO. So give you a chance all to watch it and then get fresh from the Monday morning. And then you can bring your questions, but we'll have all our notes and ready to go for each episode. So Roland, I'm looking forward to next week already.
So am I, Nick. We got all of this belly aching out of the way by me. We had to do it, but we'll just settle in on the show for what it is and enjoy it, because well, parts of it are entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure it'll continue that way. So we'll see. But anyway, thank you so much for being on the show, Roland. Thank you all for being out there.
Thank
Great
you.
questions. And don't forget, sports fans, at B-Ball Breakdown, we're not a channel, we're a conversation. You in? Are you in, Roland?
I'm definitely in.